I rebel.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. In our circles, we tend to be a little critical of state flags.
Imperial flags reign across the galaxy,
But hold some affinity for a couple of others, namely the Gadsden flag and the Come and Take It flag. The Gadsden flag is usually called the Don't Tread on Me flag, as Don't Tread on Me is what is written on the yellow background beneath a coiled snake that's about to strike. And the Come and Take It flag is the white flag with Come and Take It written in black beneath a black cannon silhouette and a black star. I'd say that these are the two most used and recognizable flags within the libertarian communities. Conservatives love them too, but as I pointed out in the Beatitudes episode, there is some strong cognitive dissonance when these flags are flown alongside a back the blue or thin blue line flag. Or not even flying, but when you see the decals of these flags next to each other on the back of a truck or something like that. I asked then, but I gotta ask again, if you are flying your Come and Take It AR-15 flag next to your thin blue line flag, who do you think is going to come and take it? It's not Iran, it's not the Russians, and it's not the Democrats. If you have your Don't Tread on Me flag flying next to your Back the Blue flag, who do you think is going to tread on you? It's not the politicians, it's their law enforcers, it's their police. Anyways, these flags have a great message and history, and as y'all know, I'm somewhat of a history nerd. So, speaking of, an unfortunately lesser known flag that has just as much, if not more significance to us, is the An Appeal to Heaven flag, or it's also known as the Pine Tree flag. If you're not familiar with this flag, it's a large white background with a single pine tree in the center with An Appeal to Heaven written above it. It was used during the American Revolution by the Continental Army. It was designed by Colonel Joseph Reed for 6 cruisers that were commissioned by George Washington on October of 1775. By July 1776, the Massachusetts General Court established it as the flag of the state navy. Today we might notice it in a drawing inside of a history book or maybe alongside the Gadsden flag during some conservative protest, but it's still kind of obscure. So with all that, I do think it's worth digging into. Sometimes phrases like Come and Take It or Don't Tread on Me kind of lose their significance as the flags gain more of a mass market appeal. We just throw them on a t-shirt and sell the flag on the side of the road, and they become symbolic, but they lose that revolutionary message that is written on them. In this case, with the Appeal to Heaven, I think it's kind of easy to just lump this in with the rest. But after taking some time to really examine what Appeal to Heaven means, I think we not only have an inspiring message, but a symbol with historical significance that demands listeners' attention. So let's rediscover the Pine Tree flag and the declaration of An Appeal to Heaven. So first, more on the flag. The pine tree was symbolic in New England as far back as the late 16th century. even before the colonists. It was called the Tree of Peace when the leaders of 5 native nations that were warring for decades buried their weapons beneath a tree planted by, and I'll try to get this right, Onondaga, who was the founder of the Iroquois Confederacy and known as the Great Peacemaker. The colonists later adopted the pine as a symbol on flags and currency in the 17th century. Leading up to the Revolutionary War, the pine tree was used as a symbol for colonist resistance and anger toward the crown. Soon after arriving to Plymouth in 1620, the Pilgrims began harvesting pine that would eventually be exported all over the world. The eastern white pine of New England also became a highly sought-after wood for the colonial shipbuilding industry because of its quality and height. In 1691, England included a mast preservation clause in the Massachusetts Charter, so they would ensure a source for 24-inch diameter trees for the Royal Navy. In 1722, a statute went into effect in New Hampshire to protect 12-inch diameter trees. 1772 saw the Pine Tree Riot in response to the statute's enforcement, and this was one of the first forceful protests against the British policies in the colonies, 2 years before the Boston Tea Party and 3 years before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. During that time, trees were marked for England with a broad arrow. Early in 1772, several New Hampshire mill owners were fined for possessing some of these marked trees. One mill owner named Ebenezer Mudgett refused to pay the fine. He was then arrested and released on bail. That night, the arresting sheriff and deputies stayed at a local inn, while Mudgett gathered with a bunch of the townspeople. Some of them offered to help pay the bail, but the majority wanted to teach the police a lesson. At dawn, Mudgett led somewhere between 20 and 40 men to the inn. With soot all over their faces so that they would not be recognized, they took tree switches to the sheriff and deputy, giving them 1 lash for every tree the mill owners were fined for. Then the rioters cut the ears, manes, and tails off of the sheriff and deputy's horses and forced them to ride out of town. After that, a colonel and a posse of soldiers were sent to apprehend all of the people involved. They eventually did arrest and fine a bunch of them, but this set into motion British laws being forcefully defied by the colonists. It's said that a version of the pine tree flag flew over Bunker Hill and was depicted in a famous painting with a red field instead of white. But that is in dispute if this flag really existed before Colonel Reed's warships. So I don't think I need to go into the irony that the Tree of Peace became a symbol of armed resistance and naval power, but that's history. So that's where the pine tree symbolism came from. But what about the phrase, an appeal to heaven? This came from John Locke's second treatise on government. This is where we get a statement intended to express the end of government's authority and the final appeal of the individual against a government that has overstepped, to a statement that seems to become an 18th century version of obey God rather than men, or God will judge me. Regardless of how we feel about it being lumped into a naval war slogan, I do think we could rediscover this phrase from Locke and keep it in mind as we try to navigate times when our own governments overstep any sense of legitimate responsibility or presumed authority. Way back in episode 24, I released an episode on Acts 5 and Peter's statement to obey God rather than men. Acts 5 and the other verses from Daniel that I go over in that episode are definitely a higher priority for Christians to examine. Always look to Scripture before historical traditions. But Locke and his 2 treatises are a big part in the origin of the United States. So it's a very relevant conversation when we are debating the state's proclaimed authority and its laws. John Locke was instrumental in the Enlightenment thought that spurred the American Revolution. Locke was born in England on the 29th of August, 1632, and passed away October 1704. He is commonly known as the father of liberalism. And of course, that's what we call today classical liberalism, because of the way the term has been co-opted by liberal progressivism, which is anything other than liberal in the traditional sense and regressive by comparison. His most influential work, the two treatises on government, was published between 1689 and 1690. The two treatises are exactly that, two separate treatises. The first part is an extended critique against Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. This part is actually fascinating for Christian anarchists. Sir Filmer's work was written between 1620 and 1642, but was published after he died in 1680. In Patriarcha, Filmer made the case for monarchy through Scripture, arguing the divine right and authority from Adam over other men, wives, and children. Locke utterly destroys Filmer's arguments, using not just Enlightenment logic, but tons of Scripture. So even though it's kind of a dead argument, the arguments from Locke actually have a lot of relevance to internal church arguments about authority of men over women, child ownership, and overall authority over other people. And it really shows the true liberal and true progressive ideas from the Enlightenment that argue for equal value between all men and women. I do highly recommend the first treatise. It's just a fascinating and well-stated argument from Locke. The second treatise is where we find our appeal to heaven. In this treatise, Locke builds off of natural law, which, if I'm not mistaken, goes all the way back to Plato and ancient Greece. So natural law didn't start with the Enlightenment, but it's that era where we usually attribute it to. Locke uses the second treatise to show, through natural law, where individuals are under no obligation to obey one another, but are each themselves judge of what the law of nature requires, and covers conquest, slavery, property, representative government, and the right of revolution. And that's where we find his use of appealing to heaven multiple times. Chapter 1 was his transition from dismantling Sir Robert Filmer's argument on monarchy, and he summed it up in these 4 points. Point 1, that Adam had not, either by natural right of fatherhood or by positive donation from God, any such authority over his children or dominion over the world as is pretended. Point 2, that if he had, his heirs yet had no right to it. Point 3, that if his heirs had, there being no law of nature nor positive law of God that determines which is the right heir in all cases that may arise, the right of succession and consequently of bearing rule could not have been entirely determined. And point 4, that if even that had been determined, yet the knowledge of which is the eldest line of Adam's posterity, being so long since utterly lost, that in the races of mankind and families in the world, there remains not one above another, the least pretense to be the eldest house, and to have the right of inheritance. He then says that now that all of that has been clearly laid out, it is impossible for rulers to claim that their power and authority comes from Adam's private dominion and paternal jurisdiction. Then he sets the direction for the second treatise to set down what he takes as political power, which he defines as a right of making laws with penalties of death and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property and of employing the force of the community, in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. Chapter 2, he explains the state of nature and the equality of all people. Chapter 3 is titled Of the State of War, and this is where we first encounter the appeal to heaven referenced. He starts the chapter with, "The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction." He goes on to express when it's justified to use force against another person, and ends with this in section 20 and 21. But when the actual force is over, the state of war ceases between those that are in society, and are equally on both sides subjected to the fair determination of the law, because then there lies open the remedy of appeal for the past injury, and to prevent future harm. But where no such appeal is, as in the state of nature, for want of positive laws, the judges with authority to appeal to the state of war once begun continues, with the right to the innocent party to destroy the other whenever he can, until the aggressor offers peace and desires reconciliation on such terms as may repair any wrongs he has already done, and secure the innocent for the future. Nay, where an appeal to the law and constituted judges lies open, but the remedy is denied by a manifest perverting of justice and a barefaced wrestling of the laws to protect or indemnify the violence or injuries of some men or part of men, there it is hard to imagine anything but a state of war. For wherever violence is used and injury done, though by hands appointed to administer justice, it is still violence and injury, however colored with the name, pretenses, or forms of law, the end whereof being to protect and redress the innocent by an unbiased application of it to all who are under it. Wherever that is not bona fide done, war is made upon the sufferers, who, having no appeal on earth to right them, they are left to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. I may have forgotten to mention that pretty much every paragraph in these treatises is pretty much just one or two sentences, so it's a little hard to break them up without leaving out part of his thought. But he is thorough. In a soundbite culture, it's hard to get a quick mic drop quote, but he can't really be misquoted by leaving out a sentence before or after the point that we're trying to spotlight. But on to his next point. To avoid this state of war, wherein there is no appeal but to heaven, and wherein every the least difference is apt to end, where there is no authority to decide between the contenders, is one great reason of men's putting themselves into society and quitting the state of nature. For where there is authority, a power on earth, from which relief can be had by appeal, there the continuance of the state of war is excluded, and the controversy is decided by that power. Had there been any such court, any superior jurisdiction on earth to determine the right between Jephthah and the Ammonites, they had never come to a state of war. But we see he was forced to appeal to heaven. The Lord the judge, says he, be judge this day between the children of Israel and the children of Ammon. Judges 11:27. And then prosecuting and relying on his appeal, he leads out his army to battle. And therefore, in such controversies, where the question is put, who shall be judge? It cannot be meant, who shall decide the controversy? Everyone knows that Jephthah here tells us that the Lord the judge shall judge. Where there is no judge on earth, the appeal lies to God in heaven. That question then cannot mean, who shall judge whether another hath put himself in a state of war with me, and whether I may, as Jephthah did, appeal to heaven in it. Of that I myself can only be judge in my own conscience, as I will answer it, at the great day, to the supreme judge of all men. So, to sum up, Locke up to this point has let us know that the state of nature is everyone being equal and without a common superior. and that the state of war comes from a person using force over another. When someone is in that state of war, and that includes with their government, that they have a final appeal to God. Locke is saying that this person has no other judge on earth, and he will appeal to God as the final judge. The next time we see Locke referring to the appeal to heaven is by jumping ahead to chapter 14, which is titled Of Prerogative. Between the chapters we already went over of the state of nature and the state of war, Locke then walks us through slavery, property, paternal power, political and civil society, as well as the beginning and end of political society and government. Also, he describes the forms of commonwealth and the extent of legislative power, as well as the legislative, executive, and federal power on the commonwealth, and then the subordination of the powers of the commonwealth. Then he brings us to his definition of prerogative. Now, I do apologize that this is nowhere near a great summation of all of Locke's points. We just don't have the time to go over the whole thing. The good thing is that if you're familiar with anything that Thomas Jefferson wrote, you have a pretty good idea of what Locke is saying. You probably already recognized phrases like legislative, federal, and executive, as these are key divisions in the United States government, and are laid out in the Constitution. On top of all that, fun fact, Thomas Jefferson was even accused of plagiarism of Locke from Virginian Senator Richard Henry Lee. Which I'm not sure if that's so bad if you are who Jefferson is doing what Jefferson did, but just looking at the accusation, it is interesting when you read Locke. You do clearly hear a lot of similar phrases in the Declaration of Independence. I'm not super studied in all of the writings that Jefferson was accused of plagiarizing, but the stuff he took or borrowed from Locke in the Declaration of Independence is solid stuff. It's noticeable, but is it really plagiarizing? I'll let you decide. But getting back to our appeal to heaven, Locke says of prerogative, this power to act according to discretion for the public good without the prescription of the law and sometimes even against it is that which is called prerogative. After laying out more details of prerogative, Locke asks this, but who shall be judge when this power is made a right use of one answer? Between an executive power and being with such a prerogative and a legislative that depends upon his will for their convening, there can be no judge on earth, as there can be none between the legislative and the people. Should either the executive or the legislative, when they have got the power in their hands, design or go about to enslave or destroy? The people have no other remedy in this, as in all other cases where they have no judge on earth, but to appeal to heaven. For the rulers in such attempts, exercising a power the people never put into their hands, who can never be supposed to consent that anybody should rule over them for their harm, do that which they have not a right to do. And where the body of the people or any single man is deprived of their right or is under the exercise of a power without right, and have no appeal on earth, then they have a liberty to appeal to heaven, whenever they judge the cause of sufficient moment. And therefore, though the people cannot be judged, so as to have, by the constitution of that society, any superior power to determine and give effective sentence in the case, yet they have, by a law antecedent and paramount to all positive laws of men, reserved that ultimate determination to themselves which belongs to all mankind, where there lies no appeal on earth, to judge whether they have just cause to make their appeal to heaven. And this judgment they cannot part with, it being out of a man's power so to submit himself to another as to give him a liberty to destroy him, God and nature never allowing a man to abandon himself as to neglect his own preservation. And since he cannot take away his own life, neither can he give another power to take it. Nor let anyone think This lays a perpetual foundation for disorder, for this operates not till the inconvenience is so great that the majority feel it, and are weary of it, and find a necessity to have it amended. But this the executive power, or wise princes, never need come in danger of, and it is the thing, of all others, they have most need to avoid, as of all others the most perilous. In general, this appeal to heaven is a right to rebel against the king. One thing I like to think about with using this idea of an appeal to heaven argument rather than just saying we can rebel is that I think it's a little more broad and allowing more options than what revolting or rebelling sounds like.
I rebel.
Most of the time when we say rebel, it's usually in a context of violent insurrection. But I'm a big fan of nullification. I went over a small era of Pennsylvanian history in an older episode that was essentially an entire state just saying no to being forced to pay taxes or even enforce taxes on each other. They just nullified every demand and went on in an anarchist society without violently rebelling. And this appeal to heaven, at least rhetorically, seems to allow more of a nullification philosophy, rather than just saying rebel or rebellion. I'd like for everyone to get this idea of knowing that they have a judge that they can appeal to that is above the earthly judges and kings. We can feel confident in that and just nullify decisions instead of thinking that the earthly judge and king holds some sort of final authority on everything. Some sense of final authority when we know that they are wrong. And maybe that's just me. All in all, even though Locke is certainly not against using violence and rebellion, his logic is still sound for the Christian to rebel by simply removing themselves or just not participating. And that alone is going to come under a lot of judgment from the people around you, and judgment from the government whose authority you are questioning. But we have a greater judge, and that is who we can appeal to. So Locke mentions this appeal to heaven in a couple more spots. The next chapter, number 15, is on conquest. I don't think I need to read such large portions at this point. I think you get the idea. But just to hit on these big points, Locke is saying we have this same appeal to heaven in matters of conquest by war. He describes this conquest as an aggressor who puts himself into a state of war with another and unjustly invades another man's right. He then equates the crown taking something from a man the same as a robber. #taxation is theft. Locke then says, we should appeal to the law, but if we're denied, we again have this appeal to heaven. Again, in chapter 19, titled The Dissolution of Government, Locke reminds the reader of this ability to appeal to heaven as they tackle the idea of forming a new government when the current state no longer functions for the people, and answers the question, who shall be judge, by saying it cannot mean that there is no judge at all. For where there is no judicature on earth to decide controversies among men, God in heaven is judge. He alone, it is true, is judge of the right. But every man is judge for himself, as in all other cases. So in this, whether another hath put himself into a state of war with him, and whether he should appeal to the supreme judge. He says a little more about the people having the power to be their own umpire if a situation arises between them and the prince, and then concludes that the people have a right to act as supreme and continue the legislative in themselves, or erect a new form, or under the old form place it in the hands as they think good. So that's it. That's the story and philosophy behind the appeal to heaven flag. What did you think? Were you already familiar with this flag? or Locke's 2 treatises on government. Regardless of preference for social structure or government formations, I think this philosophy of appealing to heaven is important for us to keep in mind as we are challenged by people that think there must be an omniscient and omnipresent government, and push back when we challenge its authority. I'll have an Amazon link to Locke's 2 treatises. I highly recommend picking it up, but you can also find it for free online, so I'll have a link to that as well. It seems like this stuff might be old and boring, but I assure you it isn't. This is the stuff that inspired the people that inspired the people that inspire us. And I think it is still relevant to check out these older resources. So check out the links, check out the Anarcho-Christian gear while you're on Amazon, and don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Thank you to Michael for being our newest patron. I really appreciate your support. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
Imperial flags reign across the galaxy.
I rebel.